Hello, good afternoon. We are together to this new session of the EHESS Spring Talk. We are going to listen to Benjamin Lemoine and Eric Monnet talk about the institutions of money and debt. So I will first introduce myself. Donc I'm a professor at EHESS. I am, as a researcher, I work on financialization of public policy. I'm very interested in the way in which financial actors take hold of social and environmental issues and how their tools and frameworks of analysis are diffused in public policies. I'm very fond of the work of Benjamin and Eric. On debt and money. I'm very happy to listen to them. The second reason why I'm very happy to moderate this talk is that we are working together in a master program. We are educating young researchers on the social science of economy. The master degree is called Institutions, Organization, Economy and Society. It has been co-created by EHESS and two universities of PSL, Paris Dauphine and Mines Paris. And the ambition of this master degree is to contribute to the development of interdisciplinary research on economic works. This includes study of different economic agents from firms, financial actors, public organization, households, the practice management methods, institutions that regulate them, and public policies that concern them, markets, transactions, and exchange that unite them, and also the consequences of this economic organization. And in this 2 years research degree, the students have different courses, and they have some courses on financial issues and money and debt, and I think that Benjamin and Eric will explain, will give you some insight about their own teaching. So now I'm presenting them. They are both very experienced and talented researchers. They have been both awarded by prestigious award, and like Benjamin is a bronze medal from the CNRS institution. The CNRS is the research French research institution, and Eric is the best young economist of 2022. Okay, now the French. Okay, so so Benjamin has published a lot of articles. Is working on the political construction of the indebted state, and I will mention two books. One is it translated, this book? No. The first one is The Order of the Debt, L'Ordre de la Dette. And the second one is La démocratie disciplinée par la dette, Democracy Disciplined by Debt. And so, yes, these two books are really remarkable. So if you can understand and read French, I really advise you to read them.
Yeah, chapters online.
Okay, and so then Eric Monnet, Benjamin is a political scientist, and Eric Monnet is an economist and historian a bit, yeah. And so he has also published a remarkable book called Controlling Credit, 1948-1973, and it's an history of the, among other things, history of the French Central Bank during the Roaring 30s. And more recently, another book only in French, this one called La Banque Providence, démocratiser les banques centrales et la monnaie. Okay, the welfare bank
It's called, it's forthcoming in English pretty soon, after the summer. It's called Central Banks and the Fate of Democracies.
Yes, so you see
a bit of drama in the title.
Yeah, you see that there is like a common language between Benjamin and Eric about democracy, banks, and debt, and so on. So now the floor is yours, guys.
Thank you, Yves.
Thank you very much. So we're very glad to be here and to present this course, and more generally also as an introduction to this great master program that was funded and is coordinated by Eve, and I think with as a key role in France, and we hope in other also more generally in Europe, to bring different perspectives from different social sciences on economic issues. And that really, as Eve has explained, that's really the principle of this and the objective of this master program. And our course, which is only one among many in this in this program, but I think shares with the other this goal of tackling economic issues with different perspective. And so, as Eva said, I mean, Benjamin is a sociologist, political scientist, and I'm both economist and historian. So our approach really mixes all these different fields and different disciplines to talk about the issue of money and money and debt. And so the course is called Institutions of Money and Debt. So what do we mean by this? So maybe it's easier to understand our approach if you distinguish it a little bit from what is maybe the common approach to these issues. So normally, and like in most textbooks in economics, you open it and you have the monetary issues on one side and the financial issues on the other side. And debt and money are distinguished and are in theory viewed as very different things. But if you have a different approach, which is the approach that we have, which more embedded in sociology and also directly linked to political issues, something which is key immediately, but actually the distinctions between money and debt is much more important than what is usually viewed in theory. Meaning that actually the money and debt can be seen more as a continuum of liquidity. So there are typical examples would be public debt. You know, when we think about money, we think about banknotes, about coins, and when we think about assets, you can think, or debt, you can think about public debt. But in many cases, public debt actually can be used by economic agents or by financial institutions today as a form of money, okay? Because when they trade, they will pay each other using this public debt. So today it's mostly the case of financial institutions that will use this liquid asset, this liquid form of debt as a form of money. But in the past, you will find many examples also of households, companies, in cases where actually they will pay with public debt or other forms of debt. So this distinction between money and debt actually is much less clear-cut as what you could think in theory. And this has important consequences, important political consequences, because and one of the things, and we'll come back to that, is when we talk about monetary policy, which is monetary of money, this has actually a lot of consequences for the policy of public debt itself, and vice versa. And we'll give many examples of this during this talk. But what does it mean also is that this difference, if it's not a theoretical difference, actually this difference is mostly an institutional difference, meaning that in different times, different periods, the frontier that economic agents will perceive as differences between money and debt is really embedded in the institutional framework, both created by regulation, but also by the way financial institutions proceed. So at the end, you have very different forms of money, and clearly there's no reason to cut a very clear line between them. But not all these forms of money are alike, obviously. So they differ by their degree of liquidity. We mean that some forms of debt are more liquid. By liquid, we mean that they can be sold very easily to other economic agents, which means that at the end they are what it's called in a hierarchy of money. And you observe this hierarchy of money, especially during crisis. I mean, it's there all the time, but you really observe what it means and how structural this hierarchy is in times of crisis, meaning that in times of crisis, all economic agents, meaning all sorts of firms, so non-financial institutions, financial institutions, will want to get the most liquid form of money. Okay, so it can be banknotes, it can be sometimes public debt. And so they will rush, they will sell the other form of money to acquire the most liquid form of money. And this is what is called the hierarchy of money, meaning that there is something at the top, which is the most liquid form of money. And again, what is very interesting is that this is not given at the beginning. I mean, we cannot tell you, this is what has always been the most liquid form of money. I mean, for centuries, this has been gold. Okay? And at the end, during crisis, agents, country will rush to just acquire gold. Today, you will not see gold as the most liquid form of money. Even there are still some people that think that, but I don't think it's prevalent. So there's no, nothing will tell you what is always a liquid form of money. This again depends on the context and on the general institutions, what we call the institution of money. So the liquidity of assets really depends on this institutional and social basis. And so is the concept of the trust of money. I mean, there are many work in social sciences, in sociology, in economics that speaks about trust in money. So what does it mean? And again, the concept of trust and the concept of safety, these are not things that are given. I mean, they're never been an asset which is by itself most trustworthy or more safe than another. So what we are interested in is to understand the construction, the building of this trust in different assets, and the building of these distinctions in liquidity during different kind of assets. And here we recognize our debt to a great tradition of thought in economics, which have been especially, but not only, quite important in France, what is called the institutionalist approach to monetary theory, and especially with André Orléans and Michel Agliota. And there is a nice quote by one of the most recent books by André Orléans, saying that indeed liquidity does not refer to any particular substantive quality that can be defined prior to market transactions. I mean, it's really during the social interactions that you can understand why an asset will become liquid. So I think that this quote by André encapsulates quite well our approach during this course. So these are the theoretical principles of the course, but as we will see in a minute, this translates into different analyses, very different topics.
André Orléans, that we are regularly inviting in our seminar, that's kind of tribute to his work.
So not only we say that we have some guiding principles on how we think about money and debt, but this course is also characterized by a series of what we call these teaching principles, and I think we pay a lot of attention to that. When we teach these issues, I mean, we first emphasize a lot the importance of controversies and crisis moments. Okay, and the reason why we do that is that we think that it's during crisis that you start really understanding, what is really at stake in terms of social and political issue when it comes to money, because this is the moment where first economic agents themselves are in a position to justify why they think about money. And Ed here has worked a lot on why these crisis moments are important to study the justification of agents. Mm-hmm. And second, this is also these crisis moments are usually times where there will be the most important changes in money. And for example, I was talking about the hierarchy of money. The hierarchy of money always exists. I mean, there is always a difference of liquidity, but it's especially during crisis moments that you observe that. So the second principle is that we pay a lot of attention in this course in the detailed financial transaction. So although at the beginning of this presentation, I mean, it was quite theoretical, but actually the course, although it has some theoretical principles, really goes into the details of how finance really works in practice. Mm-hmm. And this is true both when we study monetary issues, so the functioning of banks, of financial institutions, the functioning of central banks, and the functioning of markets of public debt. The third thing is that we have a historical approach to all this, meaning that we take into account that all what we say about this liquidity of assets, the structure of the financial system has an history, so there's a lot of past dependency, but also there have been different moments in time. So also history is an interesting thing that you see how financial systems have had very different forms over time. And there have been a lot of alternative in the way that firms can be financed, households can be financed, public debt can be financed. So we look a lot at history, both to understand the evolution and to understand what is specific to the current moments in this tradition. And the fourth thing, and again, we are in a tradition which have been very important at the HESS in this school on the study of economic statistics, that we speak a lot, obviously, when you talk about finance, about numbers, about figures, but we never take the statistics as granted. So every time we use and we look at the statistics, we also try to understand where they come from. And for example, the definition of public debt, the accounting of public debt has changed a lot over time and has a long history. And Benjamin, I can tell you for sure much more about especially the controversies, because it's also very important for how the students are involved in this course and teaching, and students are a lot involved in the way that we discuss these issues together.
Yes. Yes. So I'm just going to develop the points made by Eric just now with a particular focus on what makes this course original. That is a cross-disciplinary approach between political sociology and economics. And so, as Eric was mentioning, the boundary between money and debt is institutionally produced. And so sociology is particularly well equipped to analyze this institutional production of boundaries between money and debt. And so, as I mentioned in this slide, we are mobilizing the traditional way sociology was mobilized to analyze macro institutional monetary evolution. And for instance, we rely on the work of Frédéric Le Baron, where there is a crucial focus on the role, action, and beliefs of particular social agents that are considered as a new economic and political elite that are, let's say, making these institutions such as central bank that are very opaque, sometimes not so much visible, that are making this institution live on a daily basis. So what is important to us is how actors themselves are building this boundary between money and debt. And for instance, just another illustration of the way we rely on existing literature. We also mobilize, for instance, the recent work that is much inspired, I will come back to that just after, by STS studies, science and technology studies. And for instance, the work of one of our French colleagues, Thomas Angeletti, where you try to analyze sociologically the production of macroeconomic reality. And to do that, you have to pay attention to instrument, to the materiality of public policy, and to pay attention to social sites that are making this macroeconomic reality. There was Eric was mentioning the way that we are not taking for granted the statistics, and there was a very important sociology statistician in France named Alain Desrosières, and he was talking about the social site where macroeconomic reality is produced. And as mentioning the social site, he had in mind the macro institutions that are in charge of this macroeconomic reality. And these institutions are at the core of our course with Eric. And so let's think about national account production, planning organization, treasury department, Ministry of Finance more generally, central banks, and also intergovernmental organizations such as the International Monetary Fund. So we try to normalize methodologically the production of macroeconomic reality by using these sociological tools. There's another kind of inspiration that is more the current state of the art of political economy, and we rely a lot and discuss a lot in this course the work of Daniela Gabor, who who launched a kind of program, a research program called Critical Macrofinance. And what we add to that critical macrofinance program is precisely the way all these macrofinance configuration are embodied by actors, institutions, and also historicity. Sorry, that means that we pay attention to the historical configuration that can vary across time in order to produce this macrofinance configuration. So she was defining, Daniela Gabor, the critical macrofinance as where we are, I mean, in this global world, as a US-led financial global finance, as a set of interconnected hierarchical balance sheets, credit creation, but by market-based finance involving new forms of money and systemic liability, a system that structurally requires a de-risking state for both systemic liability and for new asset class. And she was encouraging to pay attention to the precise contours of this de-risking state. And so what we introduced with Eric is that it was not always like that. Eric mentioned it just before me, and there is this notion of reversibility and contingency of such macro configuration of macro finance, and temporalities matter. Making history can also be an issue of political conflict. And for instance, just to illustrate it, Eric and I worked on the way during the COVID pandemic. There were discussion about the relevant analogy with post-war configuration, because the volumes of debt, the volumes of money mobilized, all the actors had in mind comparison and analogies with post-war. But what we see is that the definition of the period we are living in is actually the object of a political conflict. So are we in a situation comparable to a war economy, or do we need precisely to come back to normal? And what is normalcy? How normalcy is defined? And so the definition of period, the definition of categories of history is an object of political conflicts. So embodied, just the other important thing we add to this critical macrofinance literature is the way that configuration are informed by the thickness of practices embodied by actor, instrument, beliefs, trajectories. And so to sum it up, to summarize it, we could, something we're working on with Vincent Gaillon, it's like Carl Polanyi and meets Bourdieu. That means that you're paying attention to configuration of embeddedness and disembeddedness of the economic order, and you can see all this shift from one configuration to another is done through the work of actors, controversies, crisis situation, trials, etc. So that would be the contribution of the theoretical work of Bourdieu. So there's a huge importance of investigating the state. I'm going to pass very rapidly because there's too much here. But we have an important approach in our seminar with Eric, and we encourage the students to look at a state as not something monolithic, as not something unified, as something that is structured by conflict, tension. And we rely on the work of Peter Hall and his notion of first order change, that is the routine adjustment to existing policy. The second order change, that is the changes in policy instrument to achieve shared goals. And third order change, that is more macro shifts in the goals themselves. And for instance, I was mentioning the work here of Andrea Lagna that described the Italian government use of derivative to issue its sovereign debt in the late 1990s. What is interesting is that Lagna described the Italian government use of derivative. Not only these derivative bets were based on the postulate of future convergence between Italian treasury bonds and the German bond, that is the benchmark, that was the benchmark at the time, the safe asset for the Eurozone that was in construction at the time. But above all, Andrea Lagna was showing that these bonds were naturalizing this objective of convergence and were performating a limited space of possibility for economic policies. So this horizon of convergence was actually performed and naturalized by the instrument. So this case was also interesting because it raised the issue that sometimes it's difficult to dissociate the level of change, as stated by Peter Hall, and if introducing derivative could be considered as a routine instrument, as a routine public policy, not framed by administration as a revolution in the short run, it could imply in the long run a policy shift. And it would be the same, for instance, if we consider the index bond on the inflation, actually, because it was a new kind of project, but it also raised controversy, for instance, in Great Britain by Margaret Thatcher in the early 1980s. There were a controversy between Ministry of Labour and the Treasury and the Central Bank on the other side, where the indexing bonds on inflation were protecting creditors' revenue, while in the same time, the Margaret Thatcher government was experiencing de-indexation of wages and fragilizing more and more the revenues of the workers. So I'm going to pass a bit, but there also the idea by using the work of Pierre Bourdieu that the notion of capture. Eric wrote a very interesting article with Shane Valley and on the way that the notion of financial capture was not absolutely relevant to understand what is the state in this configuration of money and debt. And if we mobilize Bourdieu, you have this critical of the notion of capture, saying that it overlooks the claim to universality of the field of public administration. That is to say that actors are constrained by acting in the name of the general interest. And it's not only a rhetoric, it implies a lot of effects of justification, effects of designing public policy and instruments that matter. And Benjamin Braun, that is who is a German political economist, developed the concept of infrastructural power, to describe the way the agency, the capacity to act of the institution is indexed on the interest of finance. It's not just a justification, but the way these institutions are thinking themselves, are thinking what is their interest, what is the general interest is aligned on the evolution of market-based finance. So it's a change that is close to an ontological change regarding the state. It's not just a rhetoric or a capture by a lobby. So Eric mentioned we are mobilizing the framework of the controversy. I'm going to develop that because what we ask to the students we have in our seminar is to choose one controversy that concern money and debt object in general, and then to construct a kind of very small dissertation on that, a small article, a small essay, it's the actual name, and they have to do investigation. They have to pay attention to the construction of statistics, to the way institutions are producing the reality of money and debt, and so they're choosing a specific controversy and working on it. And so this framework of controversy comes from the science and technology studies. I already mentioned it. The inspiration comes from there. In France, there was a very important move regarding the STS field with Michel Calon, Bruno Latour. I mentioned Alain Desrosières just a minute ago. And so this analysis of controversy is focusing on the importance of technique. Technique as not something neutral, as not something given, and that allow to follow the political effects of expertise and choice that are objectified by instruments, and that these instruments are naturalizing. And so the STS field was applied to numerous areas: industry, energy, building, health, medicine, just to give a few examples. And so in our case, in our precise case, we are looking at the way these controversy are performing the social order. And the social order is a concept that includes central banks that include money reality and institutions that are producing this reality of money. And so we're looking, for instance, at controversy between central banks versus treasury. This is a classical dichotomy, a classical conflict that cross all over the period. But we're also looking at controversy that can be raised inside specific departments of the state, between planning administration and treasury administration, etc., etc. And so we just give you here example of students' contribution in 2021 and 2022. For instance, there were controversy on cryptocurrency and public power. There was very precisely framed controversy about the ruling of Karlsruhe Court in Germany and what it implied for the debate on monetary policies. There was much more theoretical controversy about the modern monetary theory and looking at controversy inside the academic field, but also as an object of public debate, as a way it was rising and rising in the public debate, and how it was mobilized. And so let's say there was discussion about the performativity of this kind of theory. In 2022, there were controversy on the fall of Liz Truss that were very interesting. We had actually two groups of students that were involved in that. They were looking at do capital markets perform politics, because Liz Truss had to resign, and what were the causes of this resignation, and what were the role of capital market in that resignation. So
I understood well. These are the main assignment of the students. Huh? They have to prepare this essay on the controversy. They collect materials.
Exactly. This is the final essay. So they work by group. I mean, groups usually of 3 or 4 students.
Okay. Yes.
So that's why they can working with several other students. They can gather a lot of material. So sometimes it's material that they find qualitative material online, like they analyze speeches. Sometimes some of these will also involve statistics. So it's really, I mean, some of these essays are actually, it's a big dossier, and some of them were extremely good and really look like already like an article,
it looks like
exactly.
master thesis.
No, we see the thread. We push them to be very ambitious on what they want to do here, and I think it works very well. We learn a lot reading these articles, and they like actually working. It's also, I think it's very interesting we push them also to work with people who have different backgrounds, because in this master there are students that come more from a sociology background, some comes from an economic background, so some with more political science. So they come from different backgrounds. Some of them are more trained in quantitative social sciences. So it's good that they can work with people with different background and to create something which is really of extremely good quality and many times really of a prime research quality, I would say.
So really it works like that. It's the thread of the course. Like we present the framework of what does it mean to study controversy in money and debt, the theoretical framework. And from the first course, they are starting to choose a subject and then work on it all around.
Thank you.
And these controversies, obviously, I mean, in some cases, these controversies are theoretical controversies, where you have like a social scientists, economists who are taking positions, linking their positions to academic research, but it's actually pretty rare. I mean, in most of these cases, these controversies are not rooted in clear economic theory. And so it's also something that we push the student to do not apply ex ante categories of economic theory to these controversies, because in many cases you realize that actually the actors, the policymakers or the companies, I mean, they do not use clear economic theory formulated in the way that it's
welcome in the real world.
Exactly. Welcome in the real world. It's like that if you like, but it's really
that is also the link with STS studies that is very strong there to analyze that. So I give the floor to Eric for the following slide.
And so yes, this dossier, so the final essay that we discuss them frequently with the students. We encourage them to think about their topic as soon as the second or third session. But we devote the last session of the course actually to only discuss with the students about their essay and where they stand at the end, to help them. And also it's useful for the students to present to the other where they are, where they stand with what they have done, and the question of the other students usually are very useful for them in the last sessions before they turn to the final writing phase of their essay. And otherwise, I mean, the course is structured as it is here, as you can see on the slide. So first, like introduction, where we lay down the main principles and the general things that we have said about money and debt. Then there is a session more rooted in explaining what is this institutionalist approach to the issue of money and debt, where the concept of liquidity is very much debate, and what does it mean to have a social approach to liquidity. And usually these sessions is taught with André Orléans, who has also traced the long history of these issues in the history of economic thought. And then we leave theory aside, and we go really into the details of the functioning of this the financial institutions, where in the first session I explain what are central banks, so what they do today, how do they work, but providing that in a long historical perspective and trying to explain how these institutions, central banks, have evolved in the last 2 centuries, more or less. So it's clearly a large overview, but I mean the objective is to understand how, what these institutions are doing and what they have done in the past. And then Benjamin follows with a kind of similar sessions, so not on central banks but on the treasuries, so meaning the finances of the state, so the state expenditures, but also its treasuries that issue and manage public debt. Then there is a session of financial systems and trying to discuss all the recent literature that help us to understand what is a financial system. And by that we mean the fact that it's not only some isolated financial institutions like banks, stock markets, public investment banks, pension funds, but actually these different institutions, they work together in a full system where they have, each of them have a specific role in this system. And especially in this course, I devote a lot of attention to the new literature, which have I think criticized a lot the older literature, which have explained the history of financial systems by the distinctions between bank-based or market-based financial system, which is something which have been quite important in economic history of finance, but I think now is recognized as really outdated, both to think about the history of these financial systems and to think about the current system. And you realize that in all kind of financial systems, you always have been a mix of these different forms of financing, so bank-based, the stock market, but also many other kinds of financial intermediaries, which used to not be recognized as very important by the literature on this, and also on the role of the state in the financial system. So both as the state as a regulator, but also the state as an investor. So again, there is a historical perspective on this issue, and then in the next session, Benjamin goes back to the issue of really public debt and having a more international perspective. I will say also that the previous session on the financial system is also very international in the sense that it also makes links between the domestic financial systems and the international monetary and financial systems. And this is also what Benjamin does in the next session on public debt, talking about public debt issues at the global level, because as we know, it's very different when you talk about the public debt of the US or the public debt of many countries which the
global south.
The global, I mean, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, where most of the country actually could not issue so much public debt as, for example, the US is doing. So and when public debt is mostly financed by foreign capital, those political issues are obviously very different. So then each year we have another session that rotates every year. Sometimes with a guest, sometimes. So we vary every year because it's just like we want to have a topic, and sometimes it's suggested by students that we don't cover every year, but which is also new for us, and it's an opportunity to learn more things. So in the past, we have, for example, covered the issue of the new literature on ecology, so the environment and money. So what would be the monetary forms and monetary policy, for example, or the financial policies that would be consistent with sustainable environmental policies. We have covered the issue between colonialism and money, which have recently gave rise to a lot of literature. So it was also interesting to do that. We sometimes also invited last year Béatrice Cherrier, with an historian of economic thought, came to discuss with us the relationship between history of economic thought and other social sciences, which were quite interesting and also useful for the when we talk about the controversies. How to take what role should we give to economic thought and economic doctrine and economic theory when we see and we analyze controversies, publicly based controversies on these issues. And then we also devote a full session to reading of current research. So several texts, new articles in this area. So that's it for the outline. So as you see, so in total, this is we have nine sessions or 9 sessions. So it's really a mix between, let's say, like standard lectures where we just do the history of these financial institutions, but also some of the sessions are, much more devoted to more discussions with the students, collective discussions on other new topics, recent research, or the methodology. So it's really a mix, which may appear as a weird mix, but actually we think it works pretty well, and the students are very much involved in that. So we are at the moment we are quite satisfied with this balance, the way it works. So now we still have a little bit of time to give you some brief example of the kind of topic that we cover in the course. So it will be brief because so we'll try to keep it short here. But so let's start with I think a good example to distinguish our approach, which is more political and social, to more standard approach, and the two are very compatible. I mean, we use also a lot of references to economic theory, but it's also important to see what is different. And for example, if you talk about this issue of the central banks and public debt, a standard approach would just try to see, what is the impact of the financing of public debt of the central banks on standard economic variables like the inflation, GDP growth, and so on. And these are very interesting questions, but this is not the question that we talk about in this course. I mean, these are discussed elsewhere, including by us, but here we are more interested about the politics of that. And here in the current cases, I mean, it's very timely to come about that. You might know that in many countries, including in Europe now, central banks held a large part of public debt, so around 1/3 of public debt, and it's actually in Japan, with the maximum half of the public debt is held by the central bank. So at the first sight, it might be very surprising because when we were at the university with Benjamin 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were learning that central banks had no right, were not allowed to finance public debt. And so the law has not changed. So there have been no legal change, and we end up with the current situation where actually central banks can hold half of the public debt. So what has happened and how we can make sense of this, especially because, as I said, I mean, there has not been any legal change, and so you can see on this graph that this is not new. I mean, there have been, so we are here in 2021, 22. And but in the past, this is only a picture of the 20th century. But you see that in the middle of the 20th century, and especially linked to the world wars, there have been cases that central banks held a lot of public debt. So is it simply a return to the past? And we know it's not simply a return to the past, because in the past, the way that central bank purchased this public debt to finance treasury was very different, because as we have said, there's been these big legal changes in the 1990s saying now central banks are not allowed to finance public debt. So what is the difference, and what does it mean? So when you think about that, first you realize that the reason why central banks still held public debt is very much linked to what is the issue that we always repeat throughout our course, that there are actually no clear distinctions between money and debt. So once you have recognized that, it's almost straightforward that actually you cannot make monetary policy work, the politics of money, without having a politic of public debt. And this is what is clearly said by a former deputy governor of the European Central Bank, Benoît Cœuré, that said actually if you want monetary policy to work properly, you need governments being solvent under a financial assistance program. Okay, so this sentence and many others will tell you the same thing, but actually it's impossible to run politics of money without having a politics of public debt, and especially stable prices of public debt. And so this is a justification why today central banks have started to purchase so much public debt, is actually to make monetary policy work. So on this ground, you might say that there is a clear distinction, monetary policy and public debt. But I think it will be obviously foolish to say that there is no impact on public debt from the fact that the central banks held one third of it. So because in some ways, financial markets, government anticipate that indeed the central bank is going to act and to stabilize government debt prices on the market. So there is some still institutional distinctions that remain, because today the central banks cannot purchase directly public debt from the government, but it does not mean that these clear distinctions have no political and economic effect. So it means that the fact that central banks today held a lot of public debt is very different from when they held public debt 60 or 70 years ago, because the institutions are very different. Okay, so 70 years ago, central banks, when they bought public debt, they were just like making a direct loan to the treasury. So these loans was anticipated by the state budget. I mean that at the end of the year, when the Ministry of Finance is preparing the budget of the state, they will say, okay, we know that this year the central banks will lend us this amount of money, and this can no longer exist. Okay, which makes a big difference, because now all this discussion about the fact that central banks held public debt does not longer appear in the state budget, and does not longer appear, it means, in the discussions at the parliament of the state budget. So and it's a big paradox that we emphasize, that actually in the 1990s there was this law to forbid central banks to buy public debt officially on the primary market, or to finance directly the government, and the goal was that you take out, in some way, you take out politics of the financing, and the fact that today, nevertheless, it means that central banks, since they are very independent in that way, that there is no longer debate on the fact that central bank held so much of public debt, because this is no longer discussed at the parliament, because on paper central banks have no right to lend to this public debt. So this creates an interesting, I would say, democratic vacuum, where we know that this exists, but nowhere it is discussed as such. Okay, and we can then have a long discussions on what should, is this situation desirable or not? I mean, I've worked along on this issue, and the fact that I think it creates a democratic challenge today, But there is this fact that central banks hold public debt are involved. Their operations have a lot of consequences on the functioning of financial markets. Are not clearly discussed, for example, at the Parliament. And it's very important to understand why this is the case and what are the institutional basis for this lack. So it's one example of the kind of things that we discussed here. I can give you the floor.
Yes. May I ask a question? Yeah, because you explained at the beginning that you are interested and you discussed the distinction between money and debt, and that it's more complicated than said. So I was wondering if you could also maybe ask a question now, just to cut a little bit the conversation, elaborate on what are the consequences, not only in democratic, the kind of instruments, because you said it's not exactly the same public debt that we have now that was before, and so somehow it's a different kind of debt or a different kind of money, and so maybe it's also relevant not only for democracy. Did it change also the functioning of the states, maybe?
So it's functioning a lot of that. In a nutshell, so it changed. So the other way to reformulate what I've just said is that we have shifted from a world where the central banks could finance public debt through non-marketable debt, meaning debt which is not sold on the market. This is a direct loan from the central banks to the Ministry of Finance. So this debt has no value on the market, just a simple loan. And now central banks can still purchase public debt, but only debt which have been issued on the market before being purchased by the central bank. So what does it mean? It means that between the state, between the government, the Ministry of Finance, and the central banks, now you have something called the market, okay, which, as we know, does not exist as such. I mean, there's never a market. The market is a kind of abstract concept. I mean, in de facto, it means like several institutions, like some banks or some financial investors. So it means that during this, I mean, there are much more power given to these financial intermediaries. And so there is a clear connections which is made between the central banks, these financial intermediaries, and the state, and this is what Benjamin is going to talk about, which create both terms of democratic issues, on whether, I'm not sure if you will ask people whether people are well aware of the role of these financial intermediaries and what they play in the financing of public debt. And it also creates a more economic problem. It means that when you purchase this public debt, you purchase it to these intermediaries, so you influence the balance sheet of the intermediaries. And the recent debate, if you think about all the recent debates that existed, where there was these failures, especially of the Silicon Valley Bank in the US, where people were saying, oh, yeah, these banks were in bad position because they have themselves purchased a lot of public debt, and then central banks suddenly raise their interest rate. And you see that what has increased is actually the interaction between the financial systems and the central banks, the mutual interaction with that. So this has very strong consequences on the financial landscape.
Just the remark of Yves is very important, because it's not just a labeling theory, like we say, okay, there are categories of money, and that it's actual infrastructural changes that are happening in the state. And here in this table, you have the illustration of what were the different modes of financing for the states. And what you can see in blue, we could say it was a money-driven kind of state financing, where the state was functioning as a bank. It was using liquidities that were circulating in the economy in its own web of collecting liquidity. And it was using this liquidity to finance itself and to finance the state public deficit. That is the first line of this table. So in blue, you had the majority of instruments used by the state, 63% in 1952, 63.5% in 1955, were money-driven, where this collection of liquidity, highest degree of liquidity if we used Eric hierarchy in the beginning of the talk. And the debt-driven debt was not a minority, but it was just one instrument among the other. And what has changed? What has changed is the reduction of this plurality and the disparition of the blue in a way, or the diminution of the blue and the increase of the red category. And so
and with more variety also of the red category.
Yeah, the more variety of the red, absolutely, and dismantling of the plurality of the blue. And let's say the blue would only had, after in the 90s and the 80s, only one possibility, that is the direct financing of the central bank, and all the activity of the state as a bank that was collecting deposits has disappeared, and it had consequences. And this is the way the sociology is giving its contribution, because it implied a lot of change in the philosophy of the state functioning, the way the actors themselves represented this boundary. What was money? What was the money creation of the state? Was it legitimate? Did it have to be reduced? What was its important? Was it feeding inflation? If we limit this instrument, would we struggle against inflation? Would we diminish inflation, etc., etc.? That were the debate. It was not just labeling theory between money and debt, but it was a really crucial debate on what instrument are we using, what are the consequences of each instrument we use. And I'm just giving an illustration here, that the dismantling of the activities of the state as a collector of deposit, acting as a bank, was justified by struggling against inflation. And what is interesting, it was the rising of the red category, the rising of the debt, like creating a real market for debt issuing, was considered at the time as a solution against inflation. To fight inflation, we need more debt, but we need more real debt, real meaning market debt. And we need to construct a real bond market that did not exist as such. And so we had to change the instrument of treasury financing. And so just a quote that is very instructive. Maurice Pérouse, who was the treasury secretary in the mid-1960s, saying that the suppression of the state acting as a bank represented a considerable cost increase regarding treasury operation, and at the same time a causeless enrichment for the banks. And it was his opposition to the reform. It was an illustration of controversy can be really infra administration, infra state, because it was not public. So it raised question of democracy, as Eric was saying, but there was an administrative move regarding this boundary, very important for this boundary, very provoking many effects, that was just inside the administration, inside the department, confined department of the state. And so Pérouse was expressing his fears that if we renounce to these modes of financing that are driven by money, by collection of deposit, of very liquid deposit, then we will change the way state is thinking itself. And it will have, it will have to learn to behave like a debtor among any other, something it was not used to do after, like during the post-war, during the interwar period, and after the Second World War. So it has to learn again to face credit, to face the issue of credit worthiness, for instance, and to prove to creditors that it was behaving as a correct, as a good debtor. And what does it mean, etc., etc. It raised a huge debate after, but there was this huge shift in the boundary between money and debt inside state treasury that implied a lot of change after regarding the way we consider public debt. So, sorry. So I give back the floor to Eric.
So I give another example.
Yes. To leave room for discussion.
So just another example, a brief example, which I think is very useful to think about the nature of money and more explicitly about the role of institutions and how they shape the different forms of money and how people consider and view different forms of money. So a clear case, I mean, which is quite intuitive and often discussed when we talk about different forms of money, is the difference between cash, so the banknotes that you have, and the money that you have on your bank account. Okay, and today, for at least in Europe, I mean, it will clearly not be true for all countries in the world, but in our case, and if we ask most of our students, I mean, people will just like treat it as a equivalent. I mean, you view the banknotes and you view the money on your bank account as the same kind of money. Okay, but this is not the same kind of money. This is not the same kind of money. The banknote is money which is issued by the central banks. Okay, I mean, it's a debt of the central bank, while the money that you have on your bank account is a money which is a debt of a private bank, no longer a debt of the central bank. And this money has very different characteristics. I mean, the banknote is anonymous; you can share it to everywhere. Your bank account is not anonymous. I mean, your banks know what the transaction you're doing and so on, and so you have it's a very different forms of money. So when you go to an ATM and you withdraw cash, what you do is a transfer, a conversion, a convertibility between these two kinds of money. So if you're in a country where there is some deposit insurance, the banking system is extremely stable, you come to the point where you don't longer think that this is a different kind of money. Okay, but this is not natural. I mean, this is not natural at all. This has a very long history. And you have, it took like decades and decades and more than a century to reach the point that most people will not even think that these are two different forms of money and will never try to look at the news. And every time there is a bad news about their banks, they will rush to the ATM and to withdraw cash. Again, I mean, this is still happening in many countries in the world, but when you reach a stable banking system as we have today, this is not happening, at least for us. And so, as I said, I mean, in history, I mean, this has been a long way to reach that point. And also, what is also very interesting is that it will be very simple if the whole story was about the convertibility between banknotes and bank deposits. Okay, but you have much more different forms of money, especially for financial institutions. I mean, financial institutions, they deal with many different forms of assets. So they deal with very, very different forms of money every day. And for them, the convertibility between these different forms of money are very key and have a lot of influence on the price of assets on financial markets. But even for households, I mean, you can have different forms of money. And there is one historical example, which is both very important, but because we talk about the Great Depression, so the most important economic crisis in history, but which is very interesting to tell you that, because you know, the common view on the Great Depression would be there was banking crisis and there is a bank run, so people go to their bank and they withdraw their cash. Okay, and you think that just like people get cash and put all this cash under the mattress, which is sometimes what is called in history books. And this is not what happened. I mean, otherwise, I mean, you will see pictures of a country flooded with cash, because during the Great Depression, I mean, just like many banks failed. And this money partly was withdrawn in cash, but most of it was not hoarded as cash. I mean, most of the money actually went to deposits in other institutions that at that time were not banks. They were called savings institutions. So there is a long history of these savings institutions. They were mostly created in the 19th century, and they are really distinguished from banks at that time, meaning that usually these institutions, they were created by the states or with strong state support. And the purpose of these institutions were really to develop savings. So on one hand, you have commercial banks, which are there to develop credits, and they take some deposits, but they do not take most of the deposit of households. And on the other hand, you have saving institutions, which are usually developed by the state to push people to save more. And at that time, until the 1930s, commercial banks are not regulated. Okay? There is no regulation, meaning that they are very unstable, and you are never sure that you will completely recover your money. And saving institutions, on the other hand, usually they are very regulated by the state, and most of the time Clearly in France it was the case, and then you have some specificities around countries, but even more, quite generally, all these institutions, they have to invest in very safe debt. So in some countries it was only public debt. In France it was 100% public debt. So you have these big institutions that just take deposits and invest everything in government debt. So what's happening in the Great Depression, and again, it's something that you observe in all countries at the time, is that people get their money from the commercial banks and they put that in the saving institutions because it's much safer. It's much safer there. So obviously, when you do that, you lose a little bit of the facilities which are associated with a bank account. With a bank account, you have more payment services at the time. You have more checks. You can use checks, which you cannot do with savings accounts. And also, if you have an account in the bank, it's easier to borrow from this bank. Okay, while in the saving institutions, you cannot borrow from these institutions. But so in the normal times, you would prefer to have at least part of your money in the bank. But in a crisis, you say, okay, it's much better to go up the ladder of the hierarchy of money and to rush to the safest form of money at that time, saving institutions. So what happened during these times? What you see in this graph here. So in this line, you see these are the deposits in the banking systems in orange line over there, and unsurprisingly, it's completely decreased. But you see the green line here. In the green line are the deposits in saving institutions. This is for the French case here, and this is for a sample of 24 countries. So it's really something which is and here this is the ratio of deposits in saving institutions over deposits in banks. And you see there is a big jump. And at the end, at the world level, you have much more deposits in savings institutions than in commercial banks during the 1930s. So what does it mean? It means that all the deposits are attracted by these institutions, which are strongly regulated by the state, and usually invest in public debt. So at the end, then what becomes key, and you see that a lot in the parliamentary debate at the time, is what these institutions are going to do with this money. And here you are really in the politics of money. You're really in the politics of money. You can look at all the parliamentary debate at that time, because you have this trade-off, which is people are saying, okay, but these institutions should remain safe, because if they don't remain safe, they are going to go through the same thing as commercial banks. And on the other hand, some people are saying, okay, but then these institutions, they should invest in the economy and replace commercial banks, because if they don't do that, if they don't invest, I mean, the economy is going to collapse. And the choice that have been made, at least in the early 1930s in most countries, is to save this money instead of investing this money. Okay, so much that at the end you have at the end of the chain of the savings, you have just the central banks accumulating gold. Okay, which is the worst thing that you can think of in terms of economic policy. And you can see a lot of debate in the 1930s as the consequences of that. That as progressively government realized that they need to use this money to reinvest into the economy to avoid the disaster of the Great Depression, which has already taken place. Which explains a lot how then the policy of the state intervention in the financial system is going to evolve starting the late 1930s and to the post-war level. So what is very interesting in this case is that first you see how this the shift from one money to the other really depends on the institutions, on the context, on the regulation to this thing. And second, you also see, all the politics of money and how this is definitely also linked to investment and to the issue of regulation, the role of the state.
So it was financing public debt, but without investment, without public investment.
Exactly. I mean, so here again, it will differ. You have specificities across countries, but in many countries, so the state is receiving more funds,
but not using it.
And not using it. So at the end, they even decreasing. So in France, in Belgium, in the US, they are really buying gold with that. So in other countries, like in Germany, you will have a crisis of public debt, so then it collapses. And then at the end, you have this what Keynes called the paradox of thrift. That actually, if you don't invest, you just have savings that increase. But if you don't have only saving increasing, you have investment and consumption decreasing. So at the end, at the end you have less activity, economic activity, and even less saving that you used to have because you have less you have less activity.
So it was a real safe asset for the rich, for the
you have
the
the trap of the safe assets. I mean, at some you can have an economy where if your obsession is to build the safest asset, then the economy is no longer working. Okay, so safe assets need to circulate and needs to at the end lead to investment. And today, I mean, this question is coming back on the whole issue that now public debt, especially US public debt, European public debt, plays its role as safe asset. And so the issue is, okay, if the safe asset is public debt, what is the government is going to do with this debt? And this creates a lot of responsibility. I mean, what is often forgotten is that if you have a safe asset, and the safe asset is a debt, meaning that what is financed with this debt has an enormous responsibility in the working of the economy.
Okay, maybe we can. Maybe
we
can stop.
Do you have questions?
No.
Or should I? No, I think it's really fascinating the story you are telling about the differences between different form of money.
And you see on the end of this graph, it's just like it shows a ratio of credit to deposits. And if you take the aggregate, I mean, what you see that so there are much less. There is actually, contrary to what people would believe, there's no decrease of money during the Great Depression. If you take into account all the financial institutions, money is stable.
Yeah, all the different types of money.
but all the different types of money remain stable. But what decreases is credit, because the banks that were creating credit have disappeared, and the new institutions that receive money are no longer receiving credit. So this is the credit to deposit ratio, and it experienced a big fall at the time.
What I have, and if I just ask questions, some break. What about now? Because I understood that saving institutions are collecting less money, and even saving institutions are converted to banks now. On one hand, and so what would be because we were talking about the 30s. So what about now? And also, I was interested on the difference between central bank money, like banknotes, and credit money, because also you have different countries where the people in the countries, they don't have the same relationship with both. For example, you have countries where people use a lot of cash, and they don't like to pay with credit card or so on, and other country where the citizen it's almost the same. So I think that this understanding is not the same even in Europe. We travel from if we go just next door in Germany, for example, it's very clear that they don't have the same understanding. Yes, and they have also saving institutions that are stronger than ours. And also, what about these policies that are going towards cashless? These cashless systems, and especially in southern country, you have this big policy just to stop having any banknotes anymore, any cash, and only.
So these are very
the two big questions, but they are
So these are big questions, and these are questions that we definitely discuss a lot in our in our course. It will take hours to cover this, but so very briefly on the first question on the saving institutions, and so the system at least in Europe and the US have evolved a lot since the 1930s. So in a nutshell, these saving institutions now have been integrated in the banking system. So these distinctions actually no longer exist, and yet you still have some regulated deposits. In France, you have a regulated deposits, the livret A that will finance social housing, so the Caisse de dépôt. So it's not completely vanished, but in most of the saving institutions have been bought by commercial banks and transformed into commercial banks in the 1980s. And the consequence of that was the rise of deposit insurance. Okay, and this is the same thing. But actually now bank deposits are completely insured or up to a very large level, And this is the thing that now we live in a world where most deposits are insured, and then the question is how to be sure that since banks' deposits are safe, that banks will indeed invest their funds into what is really useful for the economy. And there have been a lot of discussion about that. I mean, even related to monetary policy. I mean, when there was a ECB lending to banks, there was this rule that the banks should not use that to finance housing, because there was this idea that actually it will fuel even more the housing prices, and it would not be good for the economy. So it's a debate going on. I mean, what is, you know, what is a counterpart of deposit insurance? I mean, what is the responsibility of banks, given that we have given them this big privilege in the sense of having a deposit insurance? Privilege for which they pay, clearly, I mean, they contribute to that, but it's still, I mean, there have been institutions to make that, to institutionalize the safety of bank deposits. And then on one issue, which I think is one of the most important and the most interesting issue of the time of digital money, right? And what does it mean for society? Because if in a cashless society, it means that you use only money, which again is money linked to a bank account. And the big difference between a banknote and a bank money is that bank money is not anonymous, and bank money is restricted in the sense that you need to have a bank account to use bank money. Okay, while the banknotes, everybody can use it, and it's fully anonymous. So it makes a big difference. Okay, it makes difference in terms of anonymity and universal access to money. So there's a lot of discussions going on right now on whether there could be a digital equivalent to the banknotes. I mean, something that would be fully accessible, that everybody can use, even if you don't have a bank account, and fully anonymous. So there is one private alternative to that, you know, Bitcoin cryptocurrency, but it's clearly not stable, and it has its own big issue of financial stability and even of accessibility. Even of accessibility,
it's not very easy to get that.
And so the big question today is that, you know, what would be the digital equivalent to the banknote? I mean, there's discussion on creating this, which would be called a central bank digital currency. And how would it work in practice? In theory, we will know how it works, but in practice, it's quite complicated when you take into account everything we talk about in this course, meaning that the social meaning of money, how people are going to use that, you know, the anonymity of money, for example, you know, because it can be a good thing, but it also can be a stigma, right, in some sense. So how you take that into account? So you need to come to our course to continue the discussion on this.
Okay, so do you want to go on with a new topic?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Last word on sovereign debt?
Yeah. Maybe Olaf. Sorry. Okay. Just to conclude, and it was an illustration of what.
A third illustration. Third one.
Yeah, maybe the last one.
No, okay.
But it was about the safe asset, and Eric made allusion to it when he was talking about the different types of sovereign debt you can get, because in each country, in each economy, you consider that the sovereign bonds are at the top of the hierarchy. But when you compare different countries, you have also an hierarchy between different type of economies and different type of countries. And here you can, in the economic literature, it's generally described under the term of original sin. That is to say that the debt is denominated in a foreign currency, and mainly the US dollar, considered as the top money in the world. And this is the object of debate, actually, but it's still the case. And so what is interesting is what can sociology say about this hierarchy? Is it something fixed, or can you grasp it as something that is contingent and that can vary across history. And so the actual work is to look at the way the specificity of the sovereign that is at the basis of the safe asset, because it has the ability to raise taxes, it has the ability to make the law, it has the ability to control capital on each territory, etc., is to look at and to describe precisely how these capacity of the sovereign vary across countries, and that is in specific countries, actually the government is speculating on its own degree of sovereignty, and in its bond contracts, in order to raise trust and to raise capital and to consolidate the trust of the creditors, it has to renounce to specific characteristic of sovereignty. And for instance, when the states that do not benefit from natural trust from capital market, they has to give proof of their trust, and then they're mobilizing foreign law in their bond design. That means that the contract they're issuing is not governed by their own domestic law, but governed by a foreign law, and is governed by the main foreign law of the global market, that is the US and the UK law. And for instance, in March 2009, 69% of emerging market bonds were issued being governed by New York law. And the second,
yes, just to clarify,
yes,
it's because a bond, it's a contract.
Absolutely.
It's written in a legal language.
Absolutely,
no? So it's very important to know which language.
But there will be a discussion even on that, like meaning that, for instance, lawyers are debating on, can we consider that French bonds or US bonds are a real contract? It's just a state act, but it's not a real contract that can be challenged by courts. And so, because they are the top sovereign, they do not even need to issue a real bond contract.
You don't have the agreement of two parts.
Absolutely.
Only one part is agreeing.
It's just an administrative decision to issue something, and then trust more naturally decline from this state of act. So this is actually the debate that sociology can come into the discussion and see how does this trust is enacted through different type of instruments. And so another just development is that some sovereigns are waiving their immunity as sovereign in the contract. They say, okay, if there are litigation, if there are disputes, we explicitly renounce to our sovereign immunity, because usually sovereign can avoid courts, can escape being challenged in courts because they are sovereigns. But some sovereign are explicitly waiving their immunity in the contracts. And which states are doing that? It's states of the global south that are dominating in the international hierarchy. And what you see is that when you have all these devices, all these instruments that are, let's say, diminishing the degree of sovereignty of certain states compared to other, is that you have struggle and litigation where private creditors will try, when the debt is default, where there is a default on debt, default on the initial promise, some creditors will sue the state in New York courts, in London courts, and will try after to enforce the judgments that are favorable to their interest. They have judgments, but now they need to enforce the judgment because the state don't want to respect this court order, and will try to avoid the enforcement of the judgments. And so you will have a true division of work internationally, where creditors will mobilize lawyers, but also what is called investigator. What are these investigators? Is that usually former people from intelligence service that are now working for private creditors, and that will have the knowledge on which asset of this sovereign that has to repay its debt, where its public assets are circulating around the world. And they will deploy knowledge, expertise on the localization of this state asset, and we try to seize and attach this asset. What is very interesting is that the probability of actually enforcing your judgment and seizing the assets of the sovereign, the debtor sovereign, is very low. But what do these actors hope is actually to put pressure on the sovereign and to act on pressure points in order to use it as a lever in the negotiation. And for instance, you could freeze bank account of the state and block its transaction with third parties, with banks, with corporation. You can try to immobilize very strategic symbolic assets, for instance, the plane of a president. You can you have lawyers and investigators that are deployed in order to immobilize a plane, and so the president cannot fly it anymore. And so these attempts are making the news, are in the front page of newspaper, and so it is used as a pressure point in order to force the state to settle, because these creditors do not accept the attachment to be enough to get its award, but they expect that the state will come back to the table of negotiation and in the end will settle, and then the creditors will get its money paid back. So it's just an illustration to show the imbalance between different kind of sovereign regarding actually the issuance of the bonds that can be considered as a contract or not, and then the consequences of this different type of instrument and devices. When you can be a sovereign that is being sued in New York or London courts, and then can also harassed by different type of actor, private actor, that try to bring you back on the table of negotiation and do not mobilize your sovereign capacities to make the law and to refuse payments, and so to make you an actor among other private actors.
What I think is fascinating when I listen to you is that actually you start to talk with that. You're saying that it's very important to study state because when you study money and debt. So I think the title of the conference should be State, Money and Debt, because on the one hand, when we listen to you, you said, okay, it's important to understand money and debt. We should study debt. And Benjamin has exactly is on the other side. I think he wants to understand state and say, okay, if I want to understand state, we need to work on money and debt. And so I think this dialogue between your two approaches is really fascinating, and I think it's very complementary because it's clear
that our two approaches, make clear that you cannot think about this issue. Even for sovereign debt, it's obvious that you need to understand the state, but even for private debt and for the issue of money, you cannot talk about all this issue if you don't talk about the state, because the state has important institutions like the central banks, like sometimes public bank, but also has a lot of roles in regulation as an investor. So it has many roles and many effects. But what is also interesting, and usually André Orléans, when it comes to our sessions, always emphasize that very much, that although you cannot really think about the issue of money and debt without the state, you cannot either having this theory, which is MMT, we say that the money only exists because it's backed by the state. Okay, that money just issued as and backed by taxes, and that actually it's only once the state decides that money is legal tender, then money is legal tender. Everybody accepts it, and there are many interesting cases in history when you see that even the money imposed by the state will face a lot of resistance, okay, because the state is not seen as legitimate, for example. And you have also many cases which are not public money. It's not state money. When we talk about this bank money, you see, it's not.
Yes, but if you want to understand the bank money, you need to understand the regulation of the.
Exactly. You cannot today. You cannot think about what is bank money, bank deposit without thinking about deposit insurance regulation. But you also see that it's not because the state says, okay, deposits are safe, that deposits are safe. Right? And
I understand. And so, yeah, but I think that what is also in your course is that when you study money and debt, you can say something about state. It's exactly what I think.
The other thing about André, what is very interesting and the difference is that you always keep in mind that state is one possibility among others. Like state is an embodiment of liquidity, of trust, etc., etc. But state is an historical production. It's not the same on one period and another one, and it could be another political community that will embody trust and liquidity, for instance. And like, let's thinking about regional money, etc. Like we had also Bruno Terre that was part of this course, and he was very strong about saying, okay, there are something else outside the state that is happening about trust, money, and liquidity, etc., etc. So we are very state focused. That's true. I recognize it, but we still have in mind that it's still one state is one contingent embodiment of all these processes.
Okay, I agree. My point was, sorry, was not clear. My point was that when you look at the financial instruments or the history of public debt and so on, actually you can say a lot of things about state, which is another topic. And I think that's why I thought that, Benjamin, it's one of your concerns to understand what is this sovereignty, what is this, what are these kind of bodies, what are their agency, and how looking at the financial part gives you a lot of information about so I thought that you have both in your interest.
Very interesting.
And including on the fact that the state is not a unified body and actually has many institutions, because it's also something that you see here is that the government is not the central bank, and it's not something that was that emerged in the 1990s, where there is this doctrine of central bank independence. Even before, I mean, the central bank and the government.
It's very interesting.
And even during the times where supposedly there was no central bank independence, where actually there was sometimes some big fight between the government and the central banks in the 1960s, for example. So it's the state has never been unified. I mean, the central banks, the Ministry of Finance, the public banks, sometimes the national banks, they are not a unified body speaking with one voice. I mean, you see all the controversies that arise also in the state. I mean. Because there are some even state banks specialized in industries and state banks specialized in agriculture, for example, and they will clearly not speak with the main point of view, and there will be a lot of conflict within the state.
That's why when you look at finance, you can look at how the state is organized also, and so on, because
and it's something we try to emphasize a lot, but maybe not enough. But I think it's very important that a lot of things that we do is really also embedded in a type of state that we talk about. I mean, and when you talk about public debt, I mean, as what Benjamin was saying, that if you talk about a country that is able to issue its public debt in its own currency
and domestic law,
the issues are completely different than for a country which issue its public debt in a foreign currency and in foreign law. And so, and here the asymmetry between forms of money and debt, tell you a lot about the asymmetry between states.
And what kind of state?
So exactly.
Okay, so I think we are done. Thank you, really. It was a very interesting talk. I think,
Thanks to you for creating this master and giving us the opportunity to build that.
I need to end by with announcing the next spring talk. I think it's tomorrow, and Jérôme Dokic will present a talk about the sublime as an interdisciplinary object. And so tomorrow. Thank you so much.